If you have been anything like a functioning human adult for the last few weeks, you'll have noticed that the winds of change are blowing through the so-called established world order. US President Donald Trump has gleefully turned on allies like Canada and Mexico and cozied up to Russia over Ukraine. Meanwhile, European leaders have seen the writing on the wall for NATO and are scrambling to create an independent defense plan. Like I say, if you've been paying any attention at all, this will all be pretty evident. No surprise then that our most esteemed establishment journalists just don't get it. This was Emily Maitlis on the Newsagents podcast.
I was with a former head of state recently, and I asked exactly this question, that if America can't be depended on, if it is no longer a reliable ally, what happens to Europe? Is there anyone to come to help Europe? And this person said there is talk right now of China being the backstop. And I kind of laughed, actually. I mean, I instantly laughed in their face. And I said, what are you talking about? You know, China's not going to come to Europe's aid over an issue with Russia. And this person said, actually, no, China's really, really alarmed about an unstable Russia or an expansionist Russia or an even more expansionist Russia. And then the subject was sort of dropped, backed off. And I went away and I thought about it and I couldn't work out. I mean, they just said this is the talk in some circles now. Now, I'm telling you this because I found it instantly very hard to believe, very hard to see how it was credible.
I feel like for some of our journalists, every day they wake up like a newborn baby, seeing the world for the first time. So there you have someone who's supposed to be a serious journalist laughing in the face of a world leader suggesting China could partner with Europe defensively. But why is that such a crazy suggestion? China is already the EU's second biggest export market, the US being the first. Meanwhile, the bloc imports more Chinese goods than from any other markets, and trade relations between the two powers have been pretty robust. China is also a powerful military state with the second largest defense budget in the world, again after the US, and that is a budget that's growing. Earlier this week, the country pledged to increase defense spending by 7.2%. Even relatively conservative think tanks are now arguing that closer relations with China might be Europe's best bet. Chatham House has today published this article arguing that Europe should adapt to Trumpian shifts in world politics and engage with China over Ukraine. The problem for the establishment British media in this new reality is that they have constantly framed China as a threat to the UK. In 2024, the BBC alone published around one article every month positioning China as a threat. But the question is, was that assessment based on objective analysis, or rather the UK's adherence to US foreign policy? Last year, head of MI6 Richard Moore told the BBC that China, quote, aspires to displace the United States as the foremost power. Also last year, the heads of MI6 and the CIA described the rise of China as the main intelligence and geopolitical challenge of the century in a joint interview with the Financial Times. The British media has, almost without question, followed those lines. But now that things have changed so dramatically, US foreign policy brain journalists are having a hard time confronting reality. In the rest of the Maitlis video, you can literally watch the penny struggling to drop in real time.
But I guess there is a world in which China does feel it has to become part of this equation. If, as you say, it becomes America on one side with Russia and the rest of the world, Europe, whatever, China doesn't want to see America and Russia join forces in any shape. So does China actually start having a vested interest in terms of trying to keep the peace? And I feel ludicrous saying that. I mean, you know, we know what Xi is like. We know his own expansionist plans for Taiwan. We know that he wants to have a fourth term and rip up whatever a Chinese constitution looks like. But we also know that the Chinese at the moment are talking about world order rules in a way that America isn't. So it doesn't sound as batshit as it might once have done.
Helena, what do you make of Maitlis's response to the shocking idea that geopolitics happens on the basis of shared interest rather than feelings?
Well, that's it, right? It's all about economic interreliance at the end of the day. That's the most important part of geopolitical relationships, is economic interreliance, right? And it's interesting, you know, you mentioned before how we continually get all of this kind of saber rattling when it comes to how our governments, how our politicians, our media have discussed China as a geopolitical actor. Oh, China's pushing propaganda. Or they control TikTok. It's a propaganda machine there to be able to spy on you, for example. And whilst this is true, every country engages in this kind of propaganda, especially when it comes to the internet, right? They always have done. But when China does it, they said we need to close down the Confucius Institutes because they're trying to push the Chinese soft power. When it comes to the actual propaganda they get out of China, it's mostly just, well, did you know that China built a hospital in 2 weeks? Which, that's true. That is a piece of Chinese propaganda. They push this incredibly hard when it came to disseminating this as a piece of information, because it's supposed to be talking about the economic powerhouse that China is. It wants to have economic ties with the people who it is friends with. That has been the Chinese position for a very, very long time. This idea that China wants war, Chinese is being belligerent. Well, no, it wants economic power. It wants economic soft power. This is 100% true, right? Trying to act as though like Belt and Road initiatives and trying to gain some kind of Chinese state involvement in economic projects overseas, as this is being done out of altruistic nature of the Chinese economic position. That's just untrue. They're doing it because it is beneficial to China. But let's be real, it is mutually beneficial for both of the partners in these, even if it is slightly more so for Chinese interests than the people who it is doing Belt and Road initiatives with. So it's acting sort of like the America of old, except instead of being implicit and being an imposition on the country with which it wants economic ties to, right? Rather than trying to impose it through hard power, it is explicitly doing it through what at least somewhat mutually beneficial deals, right? Akala made this very clear when they were discussing China's influence within Jamaica, for example, in an interview. And he was saying, well, when it came to the British, when it came to Western, always wanting to impose this stuff on Jamaica. When it comes to China, they were very happy to just put economic investment into things like infrastructure into Montego Bay, for example. And that is far more agreeable, even if it's for soft power reasons, even if it's for geopolitical positioning. At least there is far more benefits to the people that it's doing it with than it otherwise would be if it was the United States or somebody, or even Russia, for example, who does things far more aggressively rather than in some form of mutual benefit like China does. It's why, as a socialist for a very, very long time, seeing as that we are moving to a multipolar world, we're moving to a world where we don't just have the US as the single geopolitical hegemon. It's why I've always been respectful of what Tito was like during the Cold War, where it was about creating a non-aligned movement. It was about trying to be friendly with as many geopolitical blocs as possible. It wasn't about belligerence. It wasn't about trying to see yourself as on one side of a great lake. It was saying, well, no, we want friends. We want to build infrastructure in the global south. We want to be able to create these connections between loads of different parts of the world. And that led to them being far more prosperous than they otherwise would have been if they hadn't done it, if they're just stuck with the Eastern or Western blocs at the time. And I think that's a really good thing about trying to have a better economic interrelationship with China. It would stop them from being more belligerent with Taiwan, which is the one thing that is the question looming over this, as somebody who believes in Taiwanese independence, which, the collapse really we're seeing in Taiwan of the KMT and of the Blue Coalition shows that the KMT's like one China positioning over claiming all of mainland China, that's really dissipating away from Taiwanese politics. There is more of a push for Taiwanese independence. And if we can have greater economic interreliance with China, if we can have China being part of conversations that we're having and part of the economic bloc that is, pro-green technology, which China is, which is pro trying to rein in the excesses of the corporations, which China is to a very large extent, and the EU is to a certain extent, is why America is trying to move away from the EU, because the EU is far more likely to, control what corporations do, right? There's a reason, even if it's something super simple. Tom Nicholas was pointing this out, like your iPhone having a USB-C charger. This was imposed upon Apple for the interests of consumers by European Union laws, right? China is very happy to control through state involvement and through being more harsh on rules, which is a closer relationship that European powers have with China than they ever would have with the US, especially when it comes to the US divesting from green projects as well and being entirely owned by an oligarchy. So even if we do have this relationship, we can push the rights issues that we care about. The treatment of people like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, things like what's happening with their position on Tibet. If we have a closer economic relationship with them, we can then have more leverage in trying to get them to put human rights as more central to the things that they are doing, which we have been the main criticism of China at the moment, is the way that they have treated certain minorities within their borders. And at the end of the day, what we're seeing out of this changing world order, what we're seeing with the United States becoming more insular, becoming more isolationist in terms of its policy outside of how it deals with Israel and the Middle East, is that the Xi Jinping strategy of doing nothing and winning seems to be the best position right now.